Mutant Socialists assemble. 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 Mutant Socialists assemble.
Welcome back to Personalist Manifestos. I'm Michael Morelli, the host of this ongoing conversation about contemplative revolution. In this episode, I speak with two returning guests, political columnist and commentator David Moscrop and politician Jeff Wheeldon. As you'll discover, the origin story for what you're about to hear kicked off when David used the terms mutant socialist and bad leftist in our previous conversation. There was something about those terms and the thoughts surrounding them that helped me feel very seen and understood. And it also reminded me a lot of the conversation I had with Jeff on this show. The three of us all lean to the left in our politics, but that doesn't mean we feel totally at home within what constitutes the left today. And for me personally, this reality actually goes a fairly long way in accounting for why I started Personalist Manifestos. To explore what it could look like to venture into uncharted political territory in our fraught right, left, and center landscape today. And so I thought, well, maybe we are mutant socialists. And then the idea for this assembly was born. A mutant socialist assembly, a bad leftist conversation, where we talk politics in ways that do and don't fit with many of the options on offer today. And we see if that resonates with ourselves and anyone listening. So we cover a lot of ground here. 90s pop culture, technology, institutions, localized politics, and a whole lot more in between. And we hope, in covering this ground, you feel encouraged to practice touch the grass, love your neighbor politics, wherever you happen to be. And so, with that, here's my conversation with David and Jeff, the Mutant Socialist crew. Welcome back, Jeff and David, to Personalist Manifestos. Do you prefer David or Dave?
For the purposes of things like this, Dave, and then, for formal invitations to state events, I go by David.
Right.
But
you want
for
to
our
put your best foot
purposes,
forward.
Dave, yeah,
Can we call you Super Dave?
absolutely.
Like Super
yeah.
Dave Osborne?
Yeah, I watched that show back when I was growing up, and it was on kind of late, so it was like, oh, I'm staying up late to watch Super Dave Osborne.
Yeah.
And I watched it with my grandparents, and they had a remote control that was attached to the television by a cord, and you would press the individual buttons to go to the next. And it wasn't that long ago, it would have been the 90s, the early 90s, but they just had it forever. And I remember going up in the room that I'd stay in was like, I get to press all the buttons.
Yeah. I think the first TV that I remember, it was just the dial, no remote, but you just turn the dial.
Yep.
And, but I also watched Super Dave Osborne back in the day, and I don't remember much about that show other than the end, which always got me when they had the dummy that was his size and it was dressed up like him. And then they would just put him through all these accidents and then he would do voiceovers. That's all I remember about the show. I don't remember actually what the majority of it featured.
No, me either. I just remember getting smashed by a car, run over, dropped from a high platform of some sort. Yeah, it was simpler times.
Were you a fan?
I remember the concept, like you guys. I remember seeing him get run over and whatever else. And then I had this weird sense of surreal, like, I know this guy when I was a young adult watching Arrested Development.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he comes back as the surrogate dad.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, that was a great cameo. All right. Well, now that we've riffed on 90s popular culture, which actually seems to be our jam when we talk individually or collectively, can you just share a little bit about yourselves? I know you've been on the show before, but maybe just give a little bit of an introduction so people know who you are if they're tuning in for the first time. And then we can talk about why we're calling this episode Mutant Socialists Assemble. And then we'll go from there.
Sure. I'll jump in. My name is Jeff Wheeldon. I live in Brighton, Ontario, and I wanted to be a theological ethicist like Michael. And then I ended up getting interested in politics like David and became a politician instead.
I can't tell if that's the closest thing to being a theological ethicist or the farthest thing. We should get into that because I'm wondering. But I'm Dave Moscrop. I'm a politics writer primarily, contributing columnist at the Globe Mail and contributing writer at the Walrus and a regular writer at Jacobin and a few other places. We're Substack, and I have a podcast with a QP local in Toronto, QP 416, and that's pretty much it. Although I'll pop up here and there whenever I'm needed, and sometimes when I'm not.
That's a lot.
It sounds like a lot when
typically
you list it.
pop up when I'm not needed.
Yeah. It sounds, whenever you list it all out day to day, sometimes it doesn't feel like a lot. And then you start to list it. And like I said, oh, gosh, it is a lot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. And yet I don't know, maybe I'm projecting here, but you never silence that voice that says it's never enough.
No, because I'm also teaching and I'm writing a book that's due in December as well. And then maybe another book after that. There's some talk of it. So, it catches up. And we were talking about grading, I think, just before we recorded. And my teaching assistants do the bulk of the grading, but I do quality control. And it sometimes feels like more work than just if I were to grade it. Not because the TAs aren't talented, because they are. It's just because I'm like, okay, well, now I've got to standardize and harmonize and make sure all the things are filled. I'm like, I just should have done this.
Yeah.
That's how I feel about using AI to write something. I know so many people now who say, well, I get AI to write it, and then all I have to do is edit it and check every link to make sure everything it says is actually real. And I thought, well, I could just write it faster than I could do all of those other things.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Truth.
I've never tried to, but I know that the edits historically just take me a lot longer than the writing.
Yep.
And I'm editing a machine that hallucinates would take so much. Because I get things wrong, but I know that I don't hallucinate, or at least, I mean, I guess we can get into we could get into a little bit of epistemology here, but I'm pretty sure I don't hallucinate.
It is funny because you're totally right that, and it does really speak to, like, we're way more willing to trust a machine, an editor that hallucinates and makes things up. Like, if that was a human that was hallucinating and making things up, then that would be the last person we would ask to edit for us. But we're totally fine going to a machine to do that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I can think of a few publications that wouldn't mind, but the more mainstream, acceptable, rigorous places certainly wouldn't prefer those people.
Well, it's precisely these types of conversations that prompted us to say, what if we got together and had a conversation under the banner of Mutant Socialists? And it was David who used that term when we were having a conversation. You also used another one called Bad Leftist. And I thought both of those would be a great name for a podcast or a band, or both. And just because, Jeff, you and Dave have a bit of a history. And so just kind of talking about politics and philosophy and theology and things that we do, both when, we're recording, but also just through email and such. I thought, well, what if we got together and actually talked a little bit more about this mutant socialism that we find ourselves in the midst of. And that's kind of my origin story. Does that sound right to both of you?
I think so, yeah. I think Dave and I met on Twitter back when I still braved the wilds of Twitter. Quite a few years ago now. And I don't remember even what it was you were talking about, but I was like, okay, I think I jive with this guy. And I reached out by email and said, hey, can I read your dissertation? And you graciously sent it to me because you had been talking about that. And it was just before you put out your first book, which was also excellent, by the way, Too Dumb for Democracy, ? Pick it up, folks, if you haven't. It is more relevant than ever. And yeah, we seem to be on the same wavelength. And then you also very graciously had me on your podcast, previous podcast, a while back, talking about rural farmland conversion and how that crisis has continued to accelerate. It's worse than ever. So another evergreen issue, it seems.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It has been thank you for that, and it's been a pleasure over the years. And it's Twitter's such an interesting place because it's miserable, and it's become much more miserable, and yet the network effects are real, right? Because that's where everybody is, and still, actually, a lot of people have left, and I don't blame anybody for leaving. And I hear the critiques of people who stay, and I get them, but the network effects are real. It's like, this is where all my friends are.
Yeah.
And it's tough. And it's interesting because on Blue Sky, I'm there too. I haven't actually found that the relationships have quite built the same way. And I don't know why, but on Twitter, it kind of does. And particularly among people with whom I don't agree. I mean, you and I, Jeff and I agree, I think, on quite a lot. On Twitter, lots of people I don't agree with very much, but I've actually built really interesting relationships with them, and I'd be sad to lose those.
Yeah.
It's really, really tricky and sad.
Yeah. Well, that to me sounds like a very mutant socialist take. So to just sort of flesh out what we mean when we say that is, all of us have similar perspectives. I mean, with nuances and probably some differences if you get into the granulars. So there's a democratic socialist sort of impulse there, and yet at times we feel a little bit homeless, and not totally at home within the sort of tent that is represented by a term like that. And so we just wanted to get together and sort of say, well, maybe we create a little bit of a smaller tent or an alternative home just by talking through just the big and the small stuff that represents where we're coming from. And maybe that resonates with people, maybe it doesn't, but just have the conversation and see who's out there and say, me too, maybe. So to start, Jeff really graciously put together a list of things that he thought we could talk about. And the first question that he posed that I think would really ground our conversation here is, what does it mean to think globally and act locally? So who wants to take that one on?
Well, I think you should bring it in, Mikey, with a look at, because that is an Allolian phrase. Oh, maybe can you ground us in a short snippet of Jacques Ellul's view of living globally and acting locally?
Yeah, that's I'm more than happy to do that. I mean, it's a phrase that's also been used by anarchists in general, but Ellul adopted that for his expression of personalism, as well as his friend and colleague's expression of personalism, Bernard Charbonneau. And it was this idea that you would have a sense of global events, so you wouldn't be totally checked out of what's going on in the world, but you wouldn't be so distracted by that you would ignore what's going on around you. So you would be engaged in the local sphere, like right down to the person that you live beside, the stores that you go to, the workplace that you go to, and not just in terms of like, a sort of urban dweller or suburban dweller, but actually like in terms of the natural environment as well, being in tune to the soil that you stand on, the water that you drink, and spending time in that sphere as well, so you're not totally disconnected from your material surroundings and the people in them. And this is where definitions get a little bit tricky, because Ellul identified as a anarchist, Christian, personalist, but he also said that his understanding of the type of anarchism he was practicing was within the sort of bounds of socialism and Anarcho-Syndacalism. So if you have these different local groups, practicing what I just laid out there, they would also engage with each other periodically and talk about their common interests and work together. And through that, you kind of have a cascading effect of like this actually becomes a micro, meso, macro level phenomenon of change that recenters care for the person, care for the environment, and the types of politics that generates. So that's kind of the vision. And I find it quite compelling because it's so difficult to categorize. Like it doesn't fit within the typical categories we're offered today. And I think that actually is a strength of what Ellul and others like him offer.
Well, and like anything that is nuanced enough to really address the complexity of the world we live in, it can also be reflected in so many different ways. The first time I ever heard the phrase "think globally, act locally" was from Pauly Shore in Biodome, which I watched about 150 times when I was a kid. But in terms of how am I rediscovering that concept now, I've been stumbling into it ever since I quit Twitter, honestly. I quit Twitter, I quit Facebook. I keep telling my parents, stop reading the news. Nobody in Gaza or Ukraine has a better life because you're stressed out about the headlines you're reading as you doom scroll all day. You're ruining your mental health for the sake of no one because you are so focused on the other side of the world when you don't even know your neighbors. Like, so touch grass, ground yourself locally, pay attention to what you have a chance to do something about. And for me, that's been local politics. I sit on municipal council now in Brighton. I'm able to actually achieve change. And it wasn't that hard. You know, getting elected federally and provincially is an enormous amount of work. I've failed at that 3 times before. You know, it never gets easier. It's once you get in at that level, you probably can't achieve anything anyway. You know, ask a backbencher. And for what? I'm not sure. Whereas municipally, you know, you got to get in the top 5 out of 7 candidates kind of thing. And then, you know, I come to the council table and I ask for something and they say, oh, sure, we can do that. And I'm actually making change at a local level in a way that does engage with national and international issues. You know, we're building a climate plan in the little town of Brighton. The municipality of Brighton, 13,000 people, is building an integrated community sustainability plan. You know, and I was in the Green Party for a decade and got nothing done. So, yeah, I'm definitely grounded locally now.
Yeah, I come across this a lot because when I do panels or interviews about things, and I get a bit of a reputation for being a downer because I've just spent my life seeing the angles of the problems and saying, okay, here's the problem, here's the implications of that problem and the origins, and here's where it's going to take us, and it's nowhere good. And the problems often get worse and they grow. Climate change is a great example of that. Democratic decline is another one. Radicalization, dehumanization, and the death of community because of ways of being online and digital technologies and capitalism and so on. And none of that's getting better. And in fact, it's getting much, much worse. And then people say, well, Jesus, Dave, like, now what? Right? And you take people down into the valley, and then you have a certain responsibility to take them out of it by the time you go, because you don't want people leaving there thinking, well, everything's hopeless, it doesn't matter, I might as well be a nihilist, you know, to quote from The Big Lebowski, oh, that must be exhausting. But it actually kind of is exhausting. The great irony of that line is it's meant to say, oh, that it's ironic, but in fact it's true. It is exhausting in a way because it really depletes your humanity and any hopefulness you might have. And so I always say to people, okay, but here's the good news is that you could do something literally the moment you walk out of this room or the moment you finish this interview. You can't do everything, but you can do something, and everything that is to be done somewhere, which sounds very Zen, but it's not. It just means that everything happens locally. Even the big international things happen in a space. And so let's go to that space and ask ourselves, okay, what is immediately around me? what can I do with what's immediately around me? Maybe the implications of what's immediately around me and what I do with it are global in scale ultimately, but maybe they're not. Maybe they're local in scale, but they're nonetheless tangible. And so I say to people, go and find that space, go and find that community, go and find that group, do something with the expectation that you won't be able to do everything, and then build off from that. And the something could be, I'm going to organize locally to fund aid to Gaza or to Ukraine or to design climate-friendly policies or whatever. And those things do have broader reverberations, broader effects, but they happen in the immediacy of your community where you can actually tangibly do something. And I find that's actually really, really empowering and really, really hopeful, especially in a networked age in which, if you choose to, you can try to either scale that up or at the very least show it as an example to what others can do too. And then people start to say, oh yeah, maybe that is actually encouraging. Maybe there is a little bit of hope there. And that's what makes me hopeful. So that's such a great phrase to start with, because I do actually think it is our best chance to get things done.
One of the things that I think is really interesting that speaks to your initial point, Jeff, is parents on social media. And I teach anything from first-year undergrads, fresh out of high school, to doctor of ministry students who are, folks who've been in ministry for decades, right? And what's really interesting about some of the younger students that I have is it's noticeable the amount of them who have chosen to not be on social media, or choose technologies that are really quite fascinating. One of my students, it's called a minimalist phone. So it has a keyboard like BlackBerry keys, and the screen is kind of an old school 16-bit style screen. So he said, like, I can still go on social media, but he said I don't spend as much time because the pixelation in the color is terrible. And so it's really interesting to me that you read all these think pieces from older generations, wiser, generations, more mature generations saying, kids these days and their technology, they're wired all the time. It's warping their brains. Like, actually, I think it's boomers and Gen X and millennials who are super wired in and living in this constant fight, flight, freeze mode that you're talking about. And, it's kind of ruining our democracy. Like, that sounds exaggerated, but it's actually people on those platforms treating some of these sources as if they're like vetted news sources, and that's quote unquote informing their perspectives. And yet they're looking at younger generations, blaming them for the state of things and the hyper technological sort of existence. And I just think actually, this is anecdotal, but I see a lot of younger adults saying, I don't want a part of that because I see how damaging it is to myself and other people.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly opted out, not from some kind of high ideal. I completely broke down. In early COVID, I was already mentally comatose, and it wasn't because of COVID. It was because my life being very online and involved in what seemed like futile politics really nearly killed me. And so I turtled during COVID and used that time to rebuild my mental health and my cognitive capacities even, because even to this day, I can pick up a great article on something climate related and still feel like, wow, I need to have a nap. I can't read this. There's something broke inside of me, and getting off of social media helped it heal. So I don't think I'm the only one, but I hope that my extreme example is helpful to people to realize, oh, we don't have to live like this.
One of the questions you asked, Jeff, which I think relates here, is how do we, if that's a choice that we feel compelled to make, how do we not totally stick our head in the sand? I mean, this is language that you used, right? So we're off these platforms. how do we not totally disengage to the point where we're unengaged and missing? And that's part of the looming threat that we feel that keeps us on there.
Mm-hmm.
But I ask myself that a lot too. There was a season I went through back in 2016 when I was in the UK, and Trump was elected and Brexit happened, and I was just so dialed in to everything, and I didn't have a huge crash, but I burnt out on it and I needed to check out. But there are times where I feel like I'm not as engaged as I could be and sometimes ought to be. But I don't know how to manage that dual risk, I suppose, would be the way of putting it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that a lot of people feel an obligation to be engaged and to, even my dad talks about how we all have sort of an obligation to stay informed about the world around us. And I think that is, in general, a positive thing until it becomes something that drives you into dangerous territory in terms of having to keep up with the most awful things. And so for me, it was relinquishing that sense of obligation when I recognized that what I was doing was actively hurting me and wasn't helping anyone else. And I know that I had become pretty good at engaging with people in a positive way online, to the point where a political party actually got me to run a webinar about how to engage with trolls on the internet. And so there were a lot of people who would tell me, "Oh, Jeff, no, you can't leave Facebook. You're one of the only people making it bearable." And I wore that for years as like, oh, I have this obligation to make Facebook bearable for other people. And at a certain point, I realized how ridiculous that was. Why should I make Facebook bearable for anyone? Facebook is not bearable and should not be bearable. And so I did duck out for the sake of my own mental health. And when I did so, I had to relinquish this idea that I was neglecting an obligation. I had to put myself first for a little bit. And then I checked in after being offline for a while and realized that nothing there had changed. I wasn't actually achieving anything for anyone. I might have been inspiring a few individuals one post at a time, but I wasn't saving Facebook. It's just as much of a morass as it ever was.
Yeah, the medium is fundamentally compromising and ungovernable at scale.
Mhm.
I think you can have communities, sub-communities that are very closely governed and regulated both by fiat, by regulations and by norms.
Mhm.
But at scale, I just don't think you can. And Blue Sky is an example of that. All of the pathologies of Twitter have crept onto Blue Sky. They haven't achieved the same scale or the sort of escape velocity that brought Twitter to where it ended up. But they might, it very well might. And you say, well, there's hope because there are moderators and it's federated and so on and so forth. And like, it's better structurally, but I don't think it's going to be immune from those problems. And when I think about the way that we engage in those spaces, I just think it's always going to be fundamentally, to some extent, damaging. And then when I think about news consumption and the responsibility to be informed, from my job is every day to get up and to go into it and to spend the day in it. And it's a lifestyle choice because it doesn't stop. It's very, very hard to disconnect from it. You're really not permitted to miss much. Even if you're off, if something happens, you're back. And if you're on break for a period of time, you either figure it out while you're on break or you figure it out when you're back and you catch up and you do double time. And so if I say to normal people, I say, if you're going to do this, put on your hazmat suit, get in, get a little bit of exposure to the radiation and then get out, because you don't want it too long because it'll cook you. And but that's not true for people who do my job. It can't be. So it's tough. But for normal people, I say, yeah, okay, it's good to be informed, but don't spend too much time getting informed. You have other parts of your life. And for the longest time that we had newspapers, at least for a couple hundred years where they were newspapers in the sense that we think of them, and for the actually very short period of time, several decades, where they were fairly responsible publications, because for a long time before that they were not. You would just go, you would buy a paper, and you would read it, and then you would chuck it out, and then you'd move on with your day, and there would be no incentive to go back and read it again. And you wouldn't go back and check it every few minutes to see if it had changed, and then fight with people over it. And same thing with the broadcast, right? Can you imagine saying to people, well, 30 or 40 years ago, well, here's what you're going to do with the news is you're going to go and read it. You're going to get really mad about it. You're going to keep checking to see if it's changed. And then you're going to fight people, random people you've never met about it. They'd said that you're a lunatic. That is lunacy. And it is. But because it was so structurally abnormal with the broadcasting technology of the time, especially before cable news and with magazines and newspapers. But then, of course, the medium changes. And then it's like, oh, well, yeah, okay, this is normal. But it's fundamentally not normal. It's fundamentally not healthy. And one of the things that bothers me about the speed, the pace of technological development, the way we adopt it, and the market mechanisms that drive it is that we don't need everything. And there's some things we just simply don't need to do, or at the very least, we ought to have a rigorous debate about whether we want to do or not. AI is a good example of that. But instead, we just say, well, if you can do it, not only are you permitted to do it, you must do it. It's compulsory because it can be done. It's compulsory that you must do it. And we'll figure out what to do about it later, how to manage it as a country, as an economy, as individuals with individual psychologies and groups with group psychologies. And they think, oh, no, we can't actually. And now we're in a giant mess. And we're just doing that again with AI. And it's awfully grim.
Yeah. As you talk, it makes me think about, having read a lot of research on technology, one of the common themes is this fear of being disembodied. And there's been pushback against that fear to say, well, it doesn't actually take you outside of your body yet. I mean, transhumanism may, at some point make that possible, but it changes our relationship to our bodies. Like, we're still in our bodies, even when we're, in the metaverse, we're still in our bodies, but our relationship changes. And so I was thinking that it actually dislocates us, right? It dislocates the body, and personhood, focusing on the local, relocates us or locates us. And this is this idea of touching the grass. And so whatever, field you happen to be in, whatever approach you have, creating that space to actually relocalize yourself with real people and real environments, not sort of hyper real environments, I think is an essential counterbalance, and can counteract some of the malformation that happens when we're constantly dislocated. And within this cycle that you so eloquently described, like post read, respond, fight, post read, respond, fight. It reminds me of what one of my friends says. He's my tattoo artist, Nick. He says, the problem with online media is that it removes what he calls the punch in the face filter. So like when you're talking to a real human being in person, all of us have I might get punched in the face filter if I say this. But once you get on the screen, you become the keyboard warrior or the smartphone warrior, and that filter goes away. And even, less comedically, the part of yourself that says, not only I might get punched in the face, but actually, like, I'm punching somebody in the face and I don't even realize that I'm doing that, because the screen mediates in such a way that I don't see the very real effects that it has on people. And so again, spending time in your environment with people, interacting, like eye contact, reminds us that there are real people on the other side of the screen. And this is where we get into, I would say, our mutant socialist tendencies here, at least for me, is like, I'm not interested in destroying other people, right? I'm not interested in playing into the tactics of other folks who are destroying other people in order to reach a certain end because they believe the end justifies the means. I'm really into Mr. Rogers' energy. I've been listening to a podcast about Mr. Rogers, and his level of kindness and gentleness and the power of it has been such an encouragement to me in a time where people tend to choose the opposite. And so this is my mini sermon on this, and I think it relates though, is that whatever you happen to be in, taking that time to be in your environment and be with other people. And it's funny, you described what it's like to be a journalist, and I was like, well, it actually sounds a lot like ministry. Just different, maybe a little less technology, or like even politics, right? Like, I know that local politics, Jeff, has been a better experience for you. But one of the things that lives in my head rent free, and it's kind of funny, but it's also kind of tragic, is like, you got accused of being a goose murderer. Right? But yeah. This funds your point, David, is like, okay, maybe blue sky, there is a honeymoon period where it's like, wow, it's so free, you know, it's so great. But it's like, wherever you go, there you are. The human element creeps in. Yeah. And so not fooling ourselves into thinking that we can escape this phenomenon of some really nasty tendencies in all of us, and just having a clear-eyed view of it. So anyway, I'm talking lots now. So what do you make of what I'm saying?
I love it. I think that the local level is less prone to these things. It's not prone to these things, but it's much more difficult to dehumanize your neighbors, people who live in your actual town, who you will bump into at the post office or the cafe, than it is to do to people on the internet. And so even though everyone in my little town is still very online, if you want to know what's going on in Brighton, don't ask a counselor, you go to the Facebook page. You know, so that still very much happens here. And that's where all of the nastiness is. There might be a lot of people, you know, talking about local politics in the local Facebook group, but nobody comes to council with it. And we would love for them to come to council. Our gallery is empty. We get 2 guys who come every week. And it's the same guys. They're lovely people. All of the complainers stay home, which is, to me, a sign of progress. It's a sign that we are not sensational enough to draw people out of their homes to watch us bicker with each other, which is wonderful. But no, I think that anytime there's a mediated relationship between human beings, it's easier to dehumanize the other person. And so for me, the center of ethics across the board is, does this humanize or dehumanize? And I don't know that there's anything that is neutral in that regard. Everything either humanizes or dehumanizes. And to a certain extent, like, it's not like you want to get rid of everything that could dehumanize someone. You know, all systems naturally, inherently dehumanize people. And yet we need them to provide structure for our lives. All of our institutions will at some point dehumanize us because they fail to take into account that personalist, you know, that idea that we are all individuals, we all have our own perspectives, we all have our web of relationships. Systems in institutions don't care about that. And so we need to be in a constant state of actively humanizing others as a way of counterbalancing that dehumanizing impact of systems. And so if I'm talking to somebody online and it's too easy to dehumanize them, I need to look at what's happening in myself and what's happening in this medium so that I know, okay, why is it so easy for me to write that person off? Why is it so easy for me to throw out a shibboleth and then determine that that person is out, not one of us? You know, that kind of thing. And it is just so much harder to do that when you see somebody, when you just walk in to get the mail. So that's why I really think it's important to relocalize as a way of, you know, not that localism in itself is a high ethic, but that it's just so much harder to be dehumanizing when you're localized.
Yeah, and the tricky thing about the internet is that speaks to one of the structural problems. The other structural problem is that a lot of the traffic, a lot of the engagement, a lot of the presence is inorganic. It's strategic. it may be even geopolitically strategic, and is designed that way to disrupt, so that we could talk about, okay, how do we navigate these spaces? How do we create norms? How do we humanize, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And I think that's extraordinarily important. And yet there's this section of it that might account for, I've seen different studies and different claims, but 20, 30, 40, 50% of internet traffic, which is just phony baloney. It's server farms, and bots and geopolitical posturing by Russia, China, the United States. Let's not kid ourselves. North Korea or whomever, right? We shouldn't think that there are any powerful states that are above it. And so a lot of this is just server farms fighting each other and fighting us and us fighting them. And we fall for it sometimes. And so that doesn't exist, certainly not at scale offline. People offline are literally human beings, even if they are being inauthentic. They aren't computer programs. They aren't right. And so, as much as some might seem like they are, and so we're dealing with that element too. And not only is that a problem in and of itself, it also disrupts human interactions, because when you're conditioned to fight, or you're angry because you've been in a fight with this account, well, you've been triggered by this bot, and then you take that energy out into real people and they get angry and it cascades. And so it becomes a huge problem. And then on the humanization side and the kindness side, I try to default to that too. I mean, that's what I certainly try. That's a standard I try to set for myself. And yet I still believe that also ought to accompany some social sanction for people who aren't, who are being hostile, unreasonable, who are expressing hate, and so on and so forth. And I think we underappreciate the role of shame and social sanction in policing communities, and that communities have social sanction for a reason. And it gets kind of bastardized as well. It's cancel culture. I'm like, well, no, we've had social sanction for a really long time, where we look at people and say, well, you're behaving in a way that I just don't particularly like. It's not good for the community, and you're out. The ancient Greeks took it to the next level for a very short period of time, but sort of rather infamously with exile. I used to joke that we should bring back ostracism. Every year we all get to go on the internet and cast a ballot for who we want to ostracize, and then they have to leave for a period of, I don't know what it was, 10 years, 30 years. But the idea of that is that, look, we're going to have boundaries in this community, and if you continue to disrupt the community in ways that are counterproductive, you're out. We can't really do that on the internet. People just kind of creep back in, and worse, they get what they want by engaging and provoking, and it's triggered by these psychological mechanisms that do exist in the analog world, but that are kind of hyper powered in the digital world. And honest to God, I just have no idea how you solve that problem, other than, Jeff, sorry, you just get out.
Well, I think this gets into the territory of institutions, which is something that we're all interested in and actively engaged in. And I think this is where we're not ready to give up on them yet. I mean, David, you and I talked a bit about this in our one-on-one conversation, but the alternative, like this whole disruption that is caused by technology and what we're talking about, results in the erosion of established social institutions and the level of trust in your average social institution, right? Whether it's legal, political, journalistic, education, it's just decreasing actively. And some people would say, great, this is exactly what we want, right? Power to the people and so on. But I'm not so sure. It's kind of like language. Language is fraught, but it's all we have to communicate. So instead of just sort of chucking it out and saying it's meaningless, and instead of just destroying all the institutions and it's not like it's just going to leave a vacuum there. It's going to be filled by other things and other people and other power brokers. What if we actually took these institutions seriously enough to make them better, right? But the severe distrust and fear around that is palpable. So what are your thoughts on that element in this conversation?
I really do think that it is a function of systems dynamics. There is a level of complexity and social distance in our systems that most people don't know how to interact with our systems. You know, lobbyists and consultants exist because our systems are arcane. They are difficult to navigate, even for people who do so professionally. And so the idea that the average person is going to feel trust in a system that they literally could not navigate without professional help that charges hundreds of dollars an hour. Why would anyone ever trust these systems? Doesn't make sense. Ask any accountant about filing taxes. Why should any of us trust CRA? We don't even know what it means. So that level of complexity, and then added to that, the social distance where, if I could have a face-to-face conversation with my tax adjuster, that might make me trust the system a little bit more. But try getting somebody on the phone, so there's that distance there as well. And so you're getting sort of the worst of both worlds in that regard. And as you were saying, Michael, the reality is that our institutions, we could burn down the institutions that we have, and they would be immediately replaced because they flow naturally. They develop organically from human interaction. The only way to not have institutions is to live alone in the woods. And so what we're giving up, if we want to burn it down and start over, we have to recognize that we would be burning down something that has developed over hundreds of years through a lot of adjustments and micro adjustments on a generational basis, trying to make things more fair and more effective and more efficient over hundreds of years. And we would say, let's get rid of that and take whatever just comes out organically, which is necessarily going to be even more empowering to people who already have more power, already have more money, all of those other things. And, there are so many people who are looking for a revolution because they see that the amount of change that's needed in order to make the systems we have feel fair and empowering and humanizing to us is more than we can do through one election or something like that. And so they say, bring out the guillotines. And, no revolution of that sort has ever resulted in something better. It's just, it's saying we need a hard reset and we're willing to accept whatever comes after. And that's just so short-sighted.
It's my most Tory inclination or position is the very Burkean notion that you never tear down a fence until you know why it was put up. And it's part of the reason I end up supporting the Senate, which a lot of people on the left in this country don't support, but I do, because it actually serves a very important function. It's very easy I'm a deep Democrat. I believe in not just democratic institutions, but in representative institutions, but participatory institutions. I actually want to see citizens taking a much greater role in their self-government through things like citizen assemblies and through participatory budgeting. I think protest and civil disobedience are fundamental parts of a democratic system and so on. And yet I have to reconcile that with the fact that I also think that an unelected Senate actually has a role to play in a democratic system. And people sort of say, how can you possibly think that's true? And I said, well, if on its own, it doesn't really hold up. But when you say, okay, but it is subject to certain norms and limits about what it can actually do, that it actually plays a role in strengthening the elected side, the legislature, by saying things like, we're going to study this at committee. We're going to try to make the bill better by rigorously reviewing provisions that perhaps weren't so rigorously reviewed in the House of Commons and at committee, which is a bit of a problem. We don't write great bills in this country, despite the fact that we have big buildings full of very smart people who are supposed to do that. But politics happens. And then the Senate will agenda set and say, let's have a talk about these sensitive subjects that the House of Commons might not wish to raise, for better or for worse, incidentally, right? Cannabis and the legalization of cannabis really got started in the Senate, but so did assisted dying in many ways, which is at best complicated in recent years, I think I've at least partially reversed my support for it, perhaps on my way to fully reversing it, or largely reversing it in some cases, but because it's complicated. But then we start thinking of democratic systems. Think, oh, okay, well then we got to run these things somehow. And we run them through institutions, and I think Jeff's absolutely right, is that you could burn them down tomorrow, but you would just have a period of utter chaos followed by a need to rebuild or the organic rebuilding of it. And I often say this to people, is that freedom, somewhat perhaps counterintuitively, even ironically or paradoxically, has to exist within constraints. Like the absence of any constraint isn't freedom, it's absolute chaos. That to me, that freedom exists because you have the capacity to say yes to certain things, no to other things, and you have limits that allow you to process the world. And once those limits are gone, then it's utter anarchy in the worst sense of the word, not in the kind of nicely organized participatory sense of the word. And that's a huge problem. And so that's why, for instance, not a revolutionary socialist, at least, right? Because I think the French Revolution, which did usher in a kind of liberalization of large parts of Europe, eventually brought with it an awful lot of death and destruction, and perhaps just achieved or helped achieve something that would have been achieved anyway without all the bloodshed and chaos. And so it's awfully complicated, but I'm deeply an institutionalist, and I think it's extraordinarily important to be one.
Yeah. Thank you both for your comments. Going back, Jeff, to your point about system resets, I just, something popped in my brain, and it relates to just kind of what we've been talking about up until this point. But if you feel like you need this urgent system reset, like at a political, social, economic level, maybe you just need to take a cold plunge and reset your nervous system. And on the one hand, I'm like, that's such a, like, just like ridiculous thought to think, but it also actually, I don't know. The line between like a stupid comment, but also like a wise one is always very fine for me. But it's this idea of like, you're in this state of hyperactivity and hypervigilance and fear and anger. And maybe what you need is a nervous system reset to take a breath before you're ready to sort of take up arms and demand revolution. Right. And to say what David is saying is, why is that here? And even to ask the question, if you say, why don't we write good bills? Even if we have buildings filled with smart people, like asking that question, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, one of the things that you said would be worth talking about, Jeff, was just the corporate ownership of politics. Like, is that what has a role in it? Are there other factors that are preventing us and our institutions from actually making good and wise decisions? Like, what is it that that gets in the way of writing good bills? And I'm with you, David, on the medically assisted dying. Like, what does it say about our so-called liberal progressive democracy that a bill that can be so dehumanizing and so threatening to very vulnerable people is celebrated as, look how far we've come? And actually, we look back. I mean, I teach in the area of disability, and I take students to the sort of Greco-Roman practice of exposure, right? Oh, this person is this infant, or this person is deemed deficient or weak or not a contributor to the society. Well, let's just leave them out in the wilderness to die so they won't be a sort of drain on our society. And I say, so now we're in 2025. Have we actually changed all that much? And the sort of lights go on eventually of like, wow, like we look at those practices and say it's barbaric, but then the further you question some of these things, you're like, wow, actually. There's some similarities here, and I'm not pretending like I'm speaking on your behalf. This is Michael's perspective, but I do think that is for me at least, a case in point of what we're talking about, of the sort of internal contradictions and the real damage that the systems that we're not ready to give up on yet, still there's very real problems and contradictions and damage created by them. Yeah.
So I do want to jump in on that. I think I take a very different view from you, Michael, on assisted dying. But I think that there are, the devil's in the details. There's a lot of nuance and a lot of, even contradictions involved in something as complex as that. And so the problem there, I think the reason that we don't write good bills is because we're not willing to navigate that complexity and nuance in the middle, because we have a system that really rewards making distinctions, whether they're real or not, being as different from the other party as possible. And ultimately, I think that two-party politics, which we effectively have in Canada, maybe now more than ever, is a duopoly. Both parties benefit from being as polarized from each other as possible. And everyone else is the ones who get screwed, because then we end up in a political conversation that, at least at the rhetorical level, swings widely back and forth between these two options that have to distinguish themselves as much as possible, at least rhetorically, from each other. And then they end up governing more or less the same, because they have the same constraints of the system when they actually are in power. So, I saw a headline this morning about safe supply for drugs, and how that program was shut down at the end of the pandemic era, and how many people have died from drug poisonings because there was no safe supply, and how the people who were providing safe supply for people without a license, because they couldn't get a license, they thought, well, we're not just going to let our friends die. And so they provided safe drugs for people, and now are probably going to go to jail. That's a system where the Fifth Estate reveal this morning was, well, we've got government documents that say that their assembled panel of experts was telling them you need to expand safe supply. But what the article didn't mention, but was very apparent at the time, is that was considered a political weak point for the Liberals, because the Conservatives could just go out and say, yeah, the Liberals are handing out free drugs on the streets. That's not what was actually happening, but it didn't matter. It was a political weak point that the Liberals couldn't afford. And so actually getting to what the experts were talking about, and saying, how can we actually save people's lives, was secondary in that scenario.
You've touched on one of my great passions in democratic theory, which is the space role troubles of expertise. Because in theory, we don't want a technocracy, although several years ago in the United States, there was a Pew poll that said that people actually did want a technocracy, that something like, half of the population just said, Jesus, my Lord, just please let the experts figure it out and get out of the way. Of course, when you press people in the details and say things like, well, which experts?
The experts.
Who's experts?
Just the experts.
Just the experts. Obviously, just like go get the Platonic, the experts in a Platonic sense of experts.
Do your own research, David.
Yeah, exactly. What could go wrong? What are you going to get, measles? And it's like, okay, well, who's experts, and what if you disagree with the experts, and what if the experts disagree with one another, which they're prone to do, and then what are you going to do? And then then we got to figure it out. I'm like, yes, which is why we have democracy. And, as my old thesis supervisor said during my PhD, Mark Warren, expertise has no pre-political authority in a democracy, which isn't to say that it doesn't play a role, which it does. I was testified before Parliament, before a House of Commons committee recently as more or less as an expert. I believe in that. I think it's very, very important. But it has to be filtered through the democratic process. And yet the democratic process isn't really deliberative. It's sort of confrontational by design for the reasons that Jeff just listed. and it doesn't lead to the best bills, and it leads to the government saying, well, we'll kind of figure it out later. And again, this goes back to the Senate, is the Senate will say, well, why don't you figure it out now before we vote on it? Rather than just saying we'll leave it up to the regulatory process at the agency level or whatever it might be. And it's sort of how you get the Online News Act, and it's how you get the assisted dying bill, and the controversy and difficulties and struggles around what do we do when we're going to expand it or not expand it? Does it fit into a society in which we do effectively let people die, even though we have the resources to not let them die? I mean, I'm talking about poor people, disabled folks, and so on and so forth. We could take care of everybody. We have the technology. We have the resources. We choose not to. It's an active choice that we make collectively, formally and informally. And so in a sense, I think we're worse than the Greeks. Michael says, is it possible we haven't progressed? I think we have regressed, because we've solved a lot of the so-called problems of scarcities that ancient and medieval and other societies faced right up until, in many senses, the 20th century. We've solved a lot of those problems now. We actually don't have to live with them. We choose to live with them. And so it's deeply, deeply frustrating to me. But the experts can say that all day long. But if you can't sell it politically, they might as well not say it, and it might as well not exist. Is that the fact is that in a democratic order, the facticity, the truth of something for political purposes only exists once it's been filtered through the political process. So the question becomes, well, how do you do that in a productive way? And how do you do that in a productive way in the digital media era, where, as I often say, if you were to custom design a world hostile to making good political decisions, it would look like ours. And so it's really, really frustrating, because we could do this, but we can't. We haven't been able to in a long time. And I'll just want to close out one thing that Michael was saying that got me thinking. When you said, just take a cold plunge, I actually think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And in part because I want to go back to the French Revolution. Is one argument is that the proximate cause of the French Revolution was the price of bread. Right? The longer term causes are obviously absolute monarchy and the estate system and so on and so forth. But say the price of bread hadn't spiked, and say that the factors that led to the French Revolution just didn't line up that way, would it have gone differently? Would it have gone the way of, say, the English development of democracy, the way it had been going for some time? I mean, possibly. If France had taken a cold plunge in 1789, what would have happened? I'm not convinced the French Revolution would have happened, because I don't believe it was inevitable. And so I actually think that cold plunge is extraordinarily important to think about. I actually think that's a very sophisticated point. I just wanted to defend you from yourself there, Michael.
Well, thank you. I mean, like I say, the line between total stupidity and wisdom with me is very fine. But this conversation has helped me arrive at that realization. But that is a very interesting point about the bread, because it's the thing behind the thing too, right? Like it's like road rage, but like you get mad because somebody cuts you off, but it's all the other things that you were carrying that cause you to snap. Right. So this research has shown there's something about driving in a car. Your prefrontal cortex isn't totally running, because you're kind of in muscle memory mode. Maybe you're listening to music and you're reflecting on your day. So you're kind of in that sort of intermediate state of like emotion and reflection, and like lizard brain of like, I need to drive safe so I don't, crash into something and hurt myself and other people. So when that one thing comes along that causes you to snap, you have no sort of resistance to all this buildup that you're probably carrying around. And like I think about the whole theme of like axe the tax, right? Like how the carbon tax was that for a lot of people, but then that being removed, and Carney's sort of retort was like, well, what are you going to have to complain about now that that's removed? But this factors into points of both you're making, and Jeff, like you describe as even when parties are not campaigning, they're still campaigning. And that's never a good way to make decisions when you are the majority government. Like if you're just thinking about winning the next election or keeping your opponent sort of in their place, that's not a good way to be making decisions that affect real people beyond just, this time frame between now and the next election. But that's the sort of spectacle we've created. That's the reality that we've created. And how do we uncreate that?
Well, I think that it's not even just political parties. It's everyone who's engaged in the process, or everyone who's engaged with this realm of ideas. The angry people on Twitter are engaged in that just as much as any political party is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is in large part a matter of identity and agency. We try really hard to define ourselves by what we're against. And we feel like our performative agency is the only agency we have in a system where the only thing you get to actually do to feel like you're making justice in the world is voting once every 4 years. Your yelling on the internet becomes the way that you show who you are and what you care about and embody your values in the world. And so I think that this constant polarization and angst is really self-serving for a lot of us. It really is a way of us trying to find a place to fit in the world and be part of something bigger than ourselves when we don't know who our neighbors are anymore. So I, again, think that localizing is the way that we combat that. It's the kind of the cold plunge for your social world is to actually engage with the people who are in your neighborhood. A big fan of asset-based community development, which is this approach that really says that there are a lot of different assets within your community and that the neighborhood level is the fundamental level of democratic society. If you can engage with people at your neighborhood level, you will not feel the urge to mouth off on Twitter.
David, I see you jotting things down here. I feel like you have things you want to say, but when I think about asset-based community development, I think about one of my former office mates. He was from Dublin, and he said, we even figured out how to make mud that you can light on fire an asset. Pete, right? When you're really dialed into the local, you can even figure out that there's value in digging up mud and drying it out so you can light it on fire. It's amazing what we can do when we're dialed into our local environment.
And when we have skin in the game, when we have ownership, and to build off a point that Jeff was making, and as I was furiously taking notes, both for this and for things I want to follow up on in other capacities, is part of life in contemporary mass societies is alienation, is that we feel alienated from our communities, alienated from ourselves, alienated from our democracies. You don't have to read Marx to understand that workers are alienated from the products of their labor. Obviously they are, which isn't to say we should go back to artisanal shoemaking and blacksmithing and so on and so forth. It's not plausible for modern industrial societies. I'm not a degrowth socialist, but I do believe that when workers and communities control their workplaces and the directions of industries, they have a say in it. They have a democracy that extends not just to political representation, but to economic decisions, which in many ways are as important or more important than the strictly speaking political representation. Because look, political rights are extraordinarily important. They are meaningless if you can't eat. And it's a very Maslow, it's very, very primitive Maslow point, but it's important. And so when you give workers a say in a role in directing, this is my variety of socialism, incidentally, then all of a sudden you're focused on that, and you're focused on building that. And to go to another Jeff's point, you're not focused on mouthing off on the internet because you're doing something, you're touching grass. And I think of the days where I'm not fighting with people on the internet, which I'm sometimes prone to do because I'm no better than anybody else. it's because I'm really busy. I'm doing things. I'm not. I don't have time to scroll. I'm out in the world. We just, you might be able to see this over my shoulder. It depends how wide your shot is about how much you can see. But my office is decorated right now. The other day we decorated our house for Christmas, which we do fairly early every year. And that day, that's what I did. I spent the day, with my partner decorating the house, and she and I got all the bins out. I went through everything, and I wasn't fighting with people on the internet. I was doing something in my house that was important to me. We can scale that to our social lives and to our work lives, and it's really, really powerful. And so this goes back to a point that Jeff raised off the top, which is it's happening in your community. And you could spend 10 years in the federal arena feeling like you're doing something and do nothing, and then a couple of years locally, and all of a sudden you're transforming your community, and then that's going to outlast you. Yeah, I think that's really powerful.
Yeah. And I think that's a beautiful way to wind down here. I think about how, as I get older, and being a dad has just awakened me to the reality that people are our best work, right? Like, the most important creative work I will do is like how I treat my partner and how I treat my kids. And everything else kind of, the important things, right? The writing, the presenting, all the academic stuff. It's like that is important too. But actually, like, the people that are around me when I wake up are the most creative and lay claim to me in a beautiful way. Not an easy way, but in a beautiful way. So thank you, gents, for your time. Thank you for assembling as the Mutant Socialists. And I was really looking forward to this conversation. And
Me too.
my expectations weren't met. They were exceeded. So I look forward to our next conversation.
Same.
Yeah, we hit like 1 point out of the 3 pages of points I sent you. So
we got more points to cover in the future. That's great.
Exactly.
We could dine off of that for some time.
And we can just add to them. And
Yeah.
maybe we can, if this lands well, we can have people send in some things that they want us to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we covered a few things that make us mutants, but not too many that make us socialists. So maybe we have more to define about what a mutant socialist is.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be in process. Anything worth really defining, you can't just define totally, in one easy phrase. And I'm fine more about the mutants because I feel like X-Men is hands down the best part of the Marvel universe.
We're gonna end on that. You're gonna throw open that door and then say, "Okay, we gotta go." I have so many. Let's do one on that.
Okay, I'm down.
Yeah,
I won't open that can of worms. We'll leave that for the next one. That'll be our cliffhanger. All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Mutant Socialists assemble. 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 Mutant Socialists assemble.